de libération des mœurs, des modes de vie. Donc beaucoup de jeunes Américains partent vers la Californie, qui va devenir une espèce de dorado pour ce qu'on va appeler, enfin, ce qu'on appelle aujourd'hui la contre-culture, c'est-à-dire du coup l'émergence de nouvelles manières d'être qui mettent la drogue au premier plan, la liberté sexuelle, etc. Et dans ce cadre-là, peuvent apparaître toute une série de nouveaux magazines qui sont très différents de ceux qui ont précédé, parce que ils ont des équipes éditoriales très jeunes et ils ne se donnent aucune limite. Donc au début, les BD vont apparaître à l'intérieur, et puis progressivement, ils vont prendre leur indépendance, et on va voir apparaître toutes sortes de magazines de bandes dessinées indépendantes. Ce sont des gens qui finalement étaient enfants à l'époque de l'apparition du code d'interdiction, enfin du code de censure qu'on a vu, et donc ce qu'ils vont faire, c'est retourner systématiquement ce code et faire tout ce qui était interdit à leurs aînés, et puis bien sûr trouver des nouvelles formes extrêmement inventives de mise en page, d'organisation du récit, etc. Donc ce sont des BD qui parlent de sexe, bien sûr, de violence, de drogue, et celui qui va jouer un rôle bien sûr capital, c'est Crumb, qu'on connaît bien parce qu'il y a eu une grande expo au Grand Palais, donc il n'y a pas très très longtemps, au Musée d'Art Moderne, je ne me souviens plus exactement, je l'ai vu mais je ne me souviens plus où c'était, et en tout cas bon, il va publier, vous voyez, une parodie des comics, enfin des comic books en usage, qui s'appellera All New Zap Comics, avec une parodie de l'approbation par le comité de censure que vous avez là-haut, mais qui va bien sûr parler de tout ce qui est scandaleux pour le public américain de l'époque. Et donc on se retrouve avec une situation un peu particulière. Ce mouvement underground, finalement, il vend énormément. Les périodiques, pour autant, apparaissent et disparaissent à grande vitesse. Entre 68 et 76, donc pendant ces 8 années, il va apparaître un nombre incroyable de périodiques différents, qui sont parfois réduits à un exemplaire. Mais en même temps, ça ne veut pas dire pour autant qu'ils appartiennent à la culture de masse, voire à la culture dominante. Parce que c'est vraiment, ils sont destinés à un public très spécifique, un public hippie, beat, enfin, etc. Vous connaissez toutes ces terminologies, qui les achètent d'ailleurs dans des magasins spécialisés, au même titre que leur pipe à cannabis, ou etc. C'est un ensemble de cette sous-culture, ce qui fait que cette BD-là, finalement, n'accède pas à la reconnaissance ni dans le monde de l'art réellement, ni dans le monde du comics. En fait, on est dans une espèce d'épiphénomène qui va d'ailleurs progressivement s'arrêter.
And this movement dissipated for a number of reasons by the late 70s, a number of which simply had to do with changes in culture, the disappearance of hippie culture. Some of it had to do with new laws that made it easier to ban obscene material in local communities that also had an impact. As we get into the 1980s, though, we start to see a different kind of movement after the underground comics. The underground comics were a real force of liberation for American comics, but they were also very specifically tied to that certain period that we think of when we think of the 60s and the counterculture. Moving forward into the 1980s, comics began to address other kinds of subject matter. Art Spiegelman, who I'm sure most of you are at least somewhat familiar with, was a very important figure. He had his starts in underground comics. His first book, Breakdowns, from 1978, was a collection of work that he produced during the underground comics period of the 1970s. But whereas many of these artists were making work that was about those times, about drugs and sexuality and so forth, Spiegelman was a lot more interested in exploring the formal limits of comics. He was interested in the work of experimental filmmakers like Stan Brakhage and Kent Jacobs, and was interested in trying to find ways to apply techniques from experimental cinema to the comics page, and that was part of what motivated many of his early comics, which is a very different kind of approach than many of his contemporaries who were more interested in, depicting sex and drugs and violence. Not that there's anything wrong with that. But beginning in 1980, he and his wife, Françoise Mouly, who's from France, and had come to the United States, began publishing a new magazine called Raw, that was intended to be a platform for international avant-garde comics, work by Americans, European artists, in some cases Japanese artists, although mainly American and Western European. As we see on the cover on the right, that's by Joost Zwarte, a Dutch artist. And one of the big innovations of Raw really was that you start to see work by artists like Gary Panter, who have a stronger and more obvious connection to the world of fine arts. Gary Panter was trained as a painter and printmaker, and he really bridges the world of fine art and popular culture, but he's certainly making comics in Raw magazine and elsewhere that are much more closely connected to his practice as a painter and printmaker than they are connected to the traditions of commercial American comics.
Donc la figure bien sûr capitale qui va émerger de ce mouvement underground et de contre-culture, c'est Spiegelman. Ce qui va se passer, c'est que Spiegelman, lui, finalement, va un petit peu abandonner ces thèmes de sexe, de violence, de drogue, qui étaient l'essentiel de la BD, finalement, de contre-culture underground, pour privilégier plutôt une recherche formaliste, et notamment essayer d'importer les procédés du cinéma expérimental qui étaient en plein développement à l'époque, à l'intérieur de la bande dessinée. Et ce qui va se passer, c'est qu'il va rencontrer son épouse, donc je me souviens plus du prénom Mouly, mais Françoise Mouly, voilà, et qui est française bien sûr, qui elle-même arrive donc de la tradition aussi de la BD française, et que tous les deux ils vont créer le magazine Raw. Ce magazine Raw, qui est un très très grand format. D'ailleurs, vous voyez là en haut, il dit c'est Chiou, Alfred Jarry, Spiegelman et Jacques Tardy. On voit bien que dès le départ, c'est un magazine qui est prévu justement pour permettre la circulation entre la BD d'auteur française et la BD américaine, et même la littérature tout simplement, Jarry. Donc il y a Graphics Magazine of Postponed Suicides. Vous voyez bien le suicide qui sont repoussés, hein, etc. Bon, il y a une dimension très ambitieuse dans ce magazine qui va faire revenir finalement aussi des artistes issus des beaux-arts du côté de la bande dessinée, notamment donc Gary Panter. Et à partir de là se produit un mouvement finalement de conjonction entre la BD, mais une BD qui est donc une BD qui réfléchit même aux conditions de la narration, et puis les beaux-arts.
And of course, one of the other important innovations in Raw magazine is that this was the place where Spiegelman serialized his very famous book, Mouse, initially, which was published as small chapter booklets that were inserted into this larger magazine. Here we see the first chapter of Mouse is a small booklet on the inside cover of Raw number 2. These are the covers of some of the other little chapter booklets that were inserted into issues of Raw magazine. And when this first volume of Mouse was published in 1986, the first half of the book, it was published by a major mainstream publisher. It was in a standard book format. It was distributed to regular bookstores, not comic book stores, and it caused a huge sensation because at the time, American culture, despite some of the other things that happened in underground comics, American culture had a conception of comics that was greatly influenced by the Comics Code, which was still operating in the commercial end of comics. This idea that comics should be friendly for children, that they were disposable, that they were garbage. And for someone to make a comic that was as long as a book in a nice format, that took on the Holocaust, which is a very difficult subject matter, and that very controversially used kind of classic cartoon archetypes depicting Jews as mice and Nazis as cats. This was extremely provocative. Fortunately, it was extremely well received, and it received a lot of positive publicity in the mainstream press. So we see here, the New York Times Book Review, Spiegelman in the celebrity magazine, People magazine, sort of, getting this kind of, rock star treatment that was very unusual for a comics author. And this continued when the second volume of Mouse was published in 1991. Again, a lot of very positive publicity in very mainstream magazines and newspapers. Here in Time magazine, beyond Mickey Mouse, Spiegelman is the poet of pictograms. Okay, that's pretty good. And even more substantially, Spiegelman received the Pulitzer Prize in 1992, which is one of the biggest prizes that can go to an English language work of literature. And this was the first and only time that the Pulitzer Prize went to a graphic novel. And so he's received the acceptance of literary culture and to an extent the acceptance of the Beaux-Arts culture. There was an exposition called Making Mouse at the Museum of Modern Art in 1991. This is an installation shot from that exposition. So a dedicated, focused exhibit of Mouse at MoMA. It's a very significant event for comics. So in a way, this book, Mouse, introduced the idea of the graphic novel, introduced the possibility of comics as literature, comics as art, and it's a comic that satisfies the formal conditions of comics. It changes and therefore satisfies the cultural conditions of comics, and for the first time, it's perceived as satisfying the formal conditions of art and the cultural conditions of art. I mean, this is, oops. I mean, you don't get more art culture than MoMA. That's about as good as it gets. If you are a contemporary artist, to have an exhibit of your work at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, in America anyway, that's as good as it gets pretty much. You know, so really you've got this comic that's being accepted into the culture of the art world for the first time. So it's an acceptable part of high culture, and it's still sort of part of mass culture because publishing is mass culture. Mouse doesn't exist as a series of originals that can only be exhibited. It's also a book that you can buy at the store for $12, right? It's not mass culture the way that television is, because publishing is, you know, a little bit smaller world than true mass culture, but it's part of mass culture in that way.